For many steam railways, their ultimate expression of a passenger locomotive had 6 driven wheels. If the system in question had long distances, moderate inclines and big turntables, the 462 or Pacific wheel arrangement would prove ideal. But if the system was not as big, had many hills to climb, and did not have locomotive facilities to handle something quite as large, the 460 was the way to go. 460s are the most logical evolution from the 440. The other option was the 442 wheel arrangement. The 442s or Atlantics are better suited for sustained running. With their usually wide fireboxes, the fire is less likely to choke itself as the run goes on. However, where pulling power is concerned, you'll mostly find Atlantics scarcely better than a 440, as there is more weight added to the machine which is not over the driven wheels. This is of course not always the case, and feel free to not mention every case where a 442 trounced a 460 in the comment section. Yeah, that'll show him. The Caledonian Railway, too, had found their solace in the 440 when it came to express passenger trains. With their simple-to-understand process of enlargement of existing designs though, the 440 naturally has to hit a zenith at one point. You can only make a relatively small engine so large. The most notable incarnation of the CR's 440 enlargement were their so-called Dunella stairs. These were locomotives designed and built under the auspices of John Farkas and Mackintosh between 1896 and 1910, and would comprise of 5 classes with detail variations, such as a higher boiler pressure or cylinder dimensions. The problem, if you want to call it that, with 440s is that they forfeit power for speed and stability. Only half of the locomotive, albeit the heaviest half, is supported by the pair of driven axles. The CR is a hilly system, with perhaps its most notorious, even if not its stiffest incline, Beattock Bank laying claim to the highest point on the West Coast main line within Scotland. To the CR, 440s were beginning to show their limits come 1900, double-heading becoming alarmingly more common. But this is disadvantageous for a railway company as 2 engines on one train manned twice the facility to house them, twice the fuel needed, and twice the pay for their crews. So Team Mackintosh came up with an enlarged Dunella stair. The boiler was bigger and longer, and an extra pair of driven wheels made for an impressive 460. 2 engines of this design were built, numbers 49 and 50, appearing in 1903. The publicity machine did its job, and the pair of 460s became the flagship locos of the CR, and it's not hard to see why. Mackintosh, in truest of Victorian engineering fashion, wanted clean lines along the locomotive. Indeed, the Class 49, as it was then, was more or less a 460 large boiler Dunella stair, which themselves had very clean lines indeed. With inside cylinders worked by slide valves driven by Stephenson valve gear, numbers 49 and 50 were hardly modern-looking machines even for 1903. In 1906, Team Mackintosh had improved the 49 design slightly, and 5 more 460s were built to become the Class 903. The premier of the class, number 903, carried the name Cardean, after the country house of one of the CR's directors. This locomotive, despite not being the first Mackintosh 460 to be named, gave way to the nickname Cardean for both classes 49 and 903, and for simplicity's sake, I'll refer to both of them as one class from now on. Although to be fair, you can hardly blame people for going with Cardean as the nickname, because if you want to call the class the Sir James Thompsons after number 50, that would be quite the mouthful. The Cardeans were put to work as heavy express locos, and they quickly monopolised the 2 p.m. Glasgow to Euston train known as the Corridor. Although to be fair, there seemed to be a couple of trains which shared the name Corridor on the CR. The Cardeans would hold the train as far as Carlisle, where they would hand the stock over to a London and North Western Railway locomotive. The CR 460s would cover the 102.25 miles between Glasgow and Carlisle in 135 minutes. That's 45 miles an hour on average. This would be the same standard that the Southern Railway would later hold its Lord Nelson class to, and the Lord Nelsons were 4-cylinder 460s. These were the days of one crew, one engine. Number 903 was famously assigned to a chap called David Gibson, a temperamental character who drove his engine hard. But the Cardeans were not a smash hit. Sure, they could reliably be rostered for both the Glasgow and Edinburgh legs of the Corridor journey, but they still presented plenty of problems. Before the second batch had been built, numbers 49 and 50 could not use a turntable on the CR in their entirety. Either loco and tinder had to be turned separately, or they had to use a triangular junction. It didn't help that the tenders on the Cardeans were the longest type on the CR, as these bogie tenders allow for non-stop journeys from Carlisle to Perth or Aberdeen. Whilst the power of the Cardeans was sufficient, they still couldn't run a BTEC unassisted with the heaviest trains, despite their smaller 6-foot diameter driving wheels. Their inside cylinder arrangement was suboptimal even for 1903, as not only was it more expensive to create castings for such components, rather than just having a pair of outside cylinders, the hidden components were difficult to maintain and proved a weak point of the design. Number 903 suffered a crank axle failure in 1909, the shock of which caused the passenger train she was hauling to become detached and derail. One of 903's wheels came off and flew down the bank, but the locomotive herself managed to keep to the rails, despite the uneven number of wheels. In 1911, concerns with the design were somewhat addressed. The class received Schmidt superheaters and their mismatched cylinders were replaced by a uniform 23/4 inch by 26 inches. However, this introduced a new problem. As to go along with the superheating, the boiler pressure was lowered from 200 to 175 psi. Performance was, thusly, not greatly improved. In fact, the CR never really improved with their 460s. Out of the 8 other classes of that wheel arrangement designed by the CR, all were considered either unsatisfactory or downright failures. Much like the Great Central Railway, the CR kept relying on their 440s after big engines had proven themselves to not quite be the thing just yet. When the West Coast Railways in Scotland were amalgamated into the London, Maitland and Scottish Railway in 1923, these engines were soon to be working on borrowed time. Regular withdrawals of the Cardeans commenced in 1927, with number 905 by then number 14754. Every year from then on, one more would be withdrawn, with the original pair of 460s managing to hold out until 1933. The very last withdrawal would be number 14751, originally number 50, Sir John Thomson. It would, of course, be amiss to also not mention number 907. Number 907 was withdrawn following her involvement in the 1915 Quintonsail rail disaster, the deadliest rail disaster in Britain's history, with over 200 killed. For some people, this involvement with the crash is what the Cardeans are still most known for. Like a lot of the Caledonian Railway, the Cardeans mostly survive in legends of the glory days of Scotland's railways, deservedly or otherwise. The saying goes, if you can't be an example, be a grave warning. But the Cardeans don't even have the luxury of being such failures an obvious lesson is to be learned from them. Not enough thought had been put into their design, and they've suffered for it. At the very least, they held the standards of elegance the CR set for itself very high indeed. But if all a locomotive has to offer are its looks, maybe there is just as much use in a model of the very thing. Looking at you, LNER P2s.